Cool. Yeah, no, thanks everybody. We're going to get straight to it. We're going to be discussing why HTML forms still rule the web. So just a bit about me. I'm a senior software engineer over at OpenSauce, and what's that? Oh, sorry. And I'm from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and those are the places you can find me online. And not a big fan of spiders. And I've had multiple people ask me, why is there an alpaca on my slides? And it's just kind of some branding I adopted. In Montreal, if you go southeast, there's like tons of alpaca and llama farms for some reason. So anyways, I like this one because he looks mischievous. So cool. OK, so what are we going to cover? We're going to go back in time a bit. Then we're going to dig into some CSS for forms, including some new pseudo-classes. And we're going to discuss the Constraint Validation API. And then there'll be a short demo, because who doesn't like demos, and no pressure. Hashtag YOLO. And then we're going to wrap things up with forms and frameworks. All right, story time. Let's get to it. So just before university, I used to work at this chicken and rib restaurant as a dishwasher. And I was making $6.50 Canadian an hour. And one of the waiters there had a dad who owned a computer shop. And basically, I saved up $3,600 Canadian, which was, I still think, a ridiculous price even back then. But I bought my first computer. It wasn't my first computer. Our family computer was a Commodore VIC-20, but this is the one that I bought with my cash. And for the time, I think it was pretty decent specs, although if anybody had an i486, you could not actually play MP3s. It would skip. But anyways, shout out Napster. So yeah, I got my computer, and I got online. I started with some bulletin board services, and then I joined some walled gardens like America Online and CompuServe. And eventually, I got internet dial-up with a local internet service provider. Of course, sometimes you got interrupted, for anybody that's ever had dial-up. And then eventually, I got my hands on a browser. I started off with NCSA Mosaic, which eventually, I think, became Netscape Navigator, or it was based off of it. And this brings me to a beloved old-school site. So GeoCities, WebRings, ComicsOMS, marquees under construction, and email animated GIFs, and of course, guestbooks. The site was loved by so many that Google searches for it actually render in ComicsOMS. So hello, forms. So guestbooks were my first encounter with forms. Technically, it was the sign-up form for GeoCities, but that doesn't make for a good story, so we'll just pretend that didn't happen. And like most people, I had a guest book, and it was super cool to just see random people on the internet just saying, hey, how's it going? And for folks, it's a bit of nostalgia, but this is what GeoCities sites looked like. If you've never seen one, that's what it looks like. And I think it's pretty safe to say there's probably some color contrast issues, but we'll stay on topic. Eventually, I discovered PHP and started building stuff and YOLO FTPing and just seeing my stuff immediately. And this is something that made me fall in love with web development. I could be in like notepad.exe or Dreamweaver, FTP it up, and like literally, back at the time, because there was no build step really, it was pretty much instantaneous. And this really did hook me on the web. Aside from PHP, I also dabbled in Microsoft Active Server pages, but my first professional web development experience was with something called ASP.NET Web Forms. And I was doing this with C# and JScript, which was Microsoft's flavor of JavaScript back in the day. And yes, you heard that right. There was server-side JavaScript back in even 2002, 2004. Even before that, if you want to talk about Netscape's version. But the cool thing about ASP.NET Web Forms is, so C# is a compiled language, for one. You had templates that went with it. And one of the criteria of the template is you had to have this form on there with a run@server, which just means it processed it on the server. And you could literally not compile this if that wasn't there. So you were kind of set up for success with forms. Didn't mean you wouldn't build terrible experiences, but at least you were set up for potentially success. Other server-side frameworks came along eventually, like Rails and Django. But before all that, something happened early in 2005 that changed how we build digital experiences forever. Well, it happened before 2005, but that was the year that the term was coined. So in 2005, Jesse James Garrett coined the term AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript in XML. It's a technique that most of you know today probably is just fetch. I still call it AJAX, so whenever you hear somebody say that, you probably have an idea of how old they are. This is just a bit of mandatory nostalgia. Document.all, if you know, you know. And being able to refresh portions of a web page without a full page refresh was a game changer. And this set the wheels in motion for single-page applications. So that's Mr. Ajax just heading to the spa. And of course, the rise of jQuery was like about a year later, and this definitely helped with this new paradigm, cross-browser APIs, $.ajax. We eventually moved away from the part that was XML to JavaScript object notation, JSON, although I'm sure there's still some legacy apps out there using it. OK, so at this point, you're like, OK, Grandpa Nick, thanks for the stroll down memory lane, but let's get you to bed. So stay with me here, because there is a point to this history lesson. A lot of us in the room are web developers and use forums probably pretty frequently. What I've noticed is a couple things. I don't have concrete data on this. It's mainly vibes, observations, and experiences that I've had. But although Ajax was a great innovation, we started to hold things wrong. Spas are awesome. I'm not trashing spas. They're great. Love a good spa. It's just more how we were dealing with forms once Ajax came out. There's also some things that people have never heard about, like the Constraint Validation API, or I can't think of any talk where I've ever heard anybody talk about it. Also, there's a generation of developers that web development to them is React. This is not a knock on React. I'm a big fan of it. I've been using it since 2015. It's more a testament to its popularity and longevity, to be honest. But that said, I just want to dig a bit under that abstraction. OK, so we're going to look at some CSS stuff first. And some of this will probably be familiar to most front-end developers. But I expect, hopefully, maybe one pseudo-class you've never heard of. So we'll start off with the focus pseudo-classes. And these, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. You've probably used the focus one a million times, or focus within. I'm sure there's a lot of people that use Tailwind. So you've probably seen these in there. But these are the actual pseudo-classes. This is what Tailwind is doing under the hood. So these are great. Focus within is one of my favorites, because you can have focus on, say, an input, and then you can style its ancestor, which is, there's use cases for that. If you think of a drop zone for a file upload, you can have the drag and drop. But if you tab into the button to say browse, you can cause the whole area to just kind of say, here's my style. There's other ones. These are also I'm mentioning Tailwind because I just know a lot of people use Tailwind. But there's the valid and the invalid pseudo selector. I think these are pretty self-explanatory. So if a text input is valid, for example, it was required, somebody filled it out. If there's nothing in there, it's invalid. And you can apply styles with these. These next two, I never heard of these until a few months ago. And these two pseudo-classes came on my radar thanks to a YouTube short from Kevin Powell of CSS fame. And these handle invalid and valid states just like the previous one. But there's a main difference. And I feel like everybody's experienced this. You go to some sign-up form or whatever it is, and all of a sudden everything's red, required, or invalid email. What this does is it still applies the styling, but it only does it until you've at least interacted with it at least once. So you can load it, there's no password. You can focus it. You can lose focus. It still doesn't do anything. But as soon as you type something and then come out, then it will apply these styles. Most of these states, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just show a few here, and I'm probably missing some. Most of them are supported in Tailwind, but if the ones that aren't supported, like user valid or user invalid, you can just either add them to the CSS that comes with Tailwind if you have a global style, or you can extend Tailwind. OK, cool. And then, yeah, here's just some more. There's a ton like placeholder shown. I don't think I knew about that one. OK, cool. So we've kind of talked about like how we can display visually, when things are invalid or valid. But there's something called the constraint validation. And there's an API for this. So when HTML5 landed, I have no idea when this was, because like everything's a blur now. Like CSS changes all the time in a good way, but it's like I have no idea what version it is or whatever, or if even they version it anymore. But HTML5 seems to be like the last HTML. I don't know. We haven't heard anything since. So funny side note, I registered HTML5.ca because I'm from Canada, and ended up selling it to Microsoft without knowing, and made some good cash on that, and it was the Internet Explorer download page for a good 5 years. So anyways, and that's how I bought my first Mac, and I feel like, and that's how I met your mother. No, anyways. So we've got all these new inputs that came out. I don't remember the time frame, but you went from just plain text to all of a sudden you have an email, a telephone number, or just a number field. And along with that, you got these new attributes like pattern, min, max. There's a ton of them. I'm not going to show them all. The demo site will have some of them. And essentially, with that, there is something called the Constraint Validation API. It's on MDM. I have links to it and stuff. But there's a few things you can do with that. And I'm just going to zoom it in a bit here for myself. Cool. So the first one here, it's called check validity. And so you can actually run this, like forget React or frameworks for a second. Just picture like a raw DOM element. So like if you were to go into your editor and you did like $0 and like your dev tools, and you did .check validity, if it's an input, it would tell you whether it's valid or not. And these are things that you probably won't be doing in your day-to-day, but probably people building frameworks or like perhaps form libraries, they could use these things. And then there's another one. It's called report validity. And there's no screenshots right now because I can't really demonstrate it without the actual demo, so we'll get to it after. But report validity does the same thing, except it'll say like it's invalid or valid, but then the UI will actually kick in. So like if you have a required field, you'll see that little pop-up saying required. OK, and then there's a couple others here. So there's set custom validity. And so for example, say you had a required field, and I don't know, it was 3 characters, that minimum. The message would say like required field must be 3 letters long, or length of 3. You can actually change that, like the native browser pop-up, you can actually change that text. And that's what set custom validity does. And validation message is the actual, like it's the setter and the getter basically. The thing to know about these things though is like, because maybe you're like, OK, I'm going to create a required custom validity message, and I'm going to set it now. But the problem is, as soon as you set that message, that's when the form input becomes invalid. So any text in there, if it's not an empty string, it's going to be considered invalid. So this is something you would do when you've determined it's invalid. Aside from that, will validate. This is just, and again, these are all on the DOM elements. Some of them apply to the actual form as well if you want. This will tell you if it's going to validate or not. So for example, if it's like a read-only field or it's disabled, it's not a contender for something that's going to be validated in a form, and this will be reflected in this state here. There's also this validity object, and this just basically contains a bunch of things telling you information about the valid state of that particular element. Cool, cool. And there's also the invalid event. So basically, like say a required field, it's not filled out, and it loses focus. You're going to end up with this invalid event firing, and you can actually create a handler for that. And you can see here, this is an example of JSX. So like if you were in like solid.js or React, you can just have an on-invalid, just like an on-click. OK, demo time. Let's see how smooth this goes now. OK, first things first, this is on GitHub already. It's open source. I registered formfun.dev. It's live right now, so you can go check on your phones. It's responsive, keyboard navigable, and all that stuff. I might have to put on my grandpa glasses to see that over there. So give me a sec as we get into demo story time. So here you can see this is a required input, and it's clearly showing an invalid state right now. So I can type in something and lose focus, or I got to put 3 characters, actually. So that it's valid now. And then I can come out again. And let's come down here, and let's just say, where's the button? OK, I'm going to say, like, submit it. Now, the native validation of the browser is going to kick in. This is important to know, like, in terms of forms and the form elements. I know nobody ever really shuts off JavaScript. It does happen. Or you could have a JavaScript error. And so if you're using the platform primitives, like, even if you have fancy custom stuff, it's not going to work. But you'll default to what the browser gives you. And assuming you have, like, a form action, you'll be in that kind of progressive enhancement mode. And so that's one thing. The other thing, got to put grandpa back on here, because I'm nearsighted. Let's reset this form. OK, and you can see here, I have a setting to toggle the user CSS pseudo-classes. So I'm going to use, instead of using the invalid and the valid pseudo-selectors, pseudo-classes, I'm going to use the user invalid and user valid ones. And you can see right away, after I've reset the form, you no longer have that automatic required field showing up styling-wise. And it's only until I interact with it and then I leave that it's actually going to kick in. And so, and this is something in CSS. You can just check if there's support for it, and you can fall back to the other ones. So again, just some progressive enhancement. And again, you might not necessarily do this yourself, but I'm hoping stuff like frameworks would kick in with this potentially. But OK, let's look at another thing here. So one thing you can do with the form is you can add this no validate attribute to it. And what that does is it literally turns off form validation. So all of a sudden, you can see here if I start typing in. Did I click on the right one? I'm just going to keep my glasses on. I'm just always self-conscious in glasses. Cool, cool. Oh, how you doing? OK, cool. Yeah, so let's turn off the built-in validation. And then you're going to see all of a sudden I have my custom validation. And if we come back here, I'm in an invalid state, but you no longer see that, like, required pop-up. So I can toggle between the two. And this is like where a designer tells you, like, this looks terrible, what can we do? And this is something you can do. So like, I have a very basic custom error validation there, but you could do whatever you want. You could have your own pop-up or whatever on the element. But and the other things we can see here is the report validity and check validity. So I'm going to run check validity. It's going to say it's false. You see how nothing has happened there. And if I put on the built-in validation again, I'm going to say report validity. It does the same thing, but it programmatically actually fires to say that there's an invalid field there. So, platform for the win, web platform for the win. And I'll just show a couple other things here real quickly. But so right now it's editable, and you see the will validate here. It's true. As soon as I switch it to, like, ready, it's false. Sorry, read only, not ready, or disabled. But as soon as I come back to editable, all this. Not editable, editable. It is California, but yeah, anyways. You can see all of a sudden it's a contender again to be validated. So this tool was built because I was basically procrastinating from doing my actual slides. So it started off as a small thing. I was going to do a code pen, but then I just kept procrastinating, and so I built this. And for folks that are curious, it's actually built with Astro and solid.js, and I'm using Mutation Observer as well. And all the things we talked about, like, there's a list of pseudo-classes with links to MDN, and there's also, like, the Constraint Validation API. And like I said, it's on GitHub too. And I got to say, I love those view transitions too. All right, cool. Let's get back to where we were. We're almost done here. Cool. So yeah, that's where you can find it. There's the source code. All right, so let's talk about forms and frameworks. And kind of what I was saying before, like, once the Ajax era happened, basically we're kind of holding things wrong. And like, I don't know about you, but like, you never really heard much about forms in terms of frameworks. But nowadays, it seems to be like a Cambrian explosion of like, hey, forms this, forms that. And I used to work on the Netlify frameworks team, so I'm very aware of a lot of this. But you can see like a lot of frameworks like Remix and like Fresh from Dino. There's many more. I don't have all of them here. These are just like a cross-section of all of them. But basically, you know, the request, response, and also leveraging form data. And this is why you want to have things in a form, because you just get all that information contained in the form data. Whereas if you didn't use a form, you could technically still use like an input, but then like if you had several, you're going to basically have to do it programmatically or through the framework to say, go get that thing, go get that. Whereas you can just say, there's even literally a form.elements field, and you can get all of the elements. And then there's also you do a new form data, and then you can get all that information as well. Also, you know, like a lot of the frameworks have dedicated form components. Like, again, these aren't all of them, but like Next.js, Remix, Redwood, and even like Next. And you're seeing this as well in the React ecosystem. There's like server actions now. There's form hooks. You know, actions in general frameworks like Next.js, Astro, Solid Start. I haven't looked at Tan Start yet, but I feel like that's probably in there too. But we'll hear from Tanner later, and we'll see. The other thing I like, this is kind of like from the old school PHP, is like being able to do a form post or a form get to the actual page you're on. And you couldn't do this in some frameworks at some point. And like I see Astro doing this. You can do this in Fresh, Remix. Again, I'm not going through an exhaustive list, but yeah, it's just really cool to see that. And I honestly don't know why this started happening. It's a good thing, but it's just cool to see that forms are, I guess, cool again. Not to sound like grandpa, but anyways. That's pretty much it. All the resources are here, including the dancing baby that you saw on the GeoCities page. And you can check out the slide deck here if you want. And yeah, that's it. Thanks, everybody.